So I was tipped off to this story initially by Kyle Kulinski, who does a great show on our network, Secular Talk. You should check it out. My old friend Tom Hartman, we used to do radio together back in the day, wrote a really interesting article about the origins of the Second Amendment. Now, let's acknowledge in the beginning that, of course, history is always nuanced, and there are many different components that go into any one thing, including the Second Amendment, and how it came to be. So people do make legitimate points about how there was the English Bill of Rights, and they talked about the need for arms. They didn't want the king to have all the arms. Well, that would create a political problem for them, especially among the different religions that quite often went to war in England. Now, we didn't have similar religious problems, but we did have issues between the North and the South and other ones here in the United States. And it talks, of course, the Second Amendment does, about a well-regulated militia. And there were militias in the North as well as the South. But the militias in the South also had a different name. They were called slave patrols. Interesting. So, we're going to get to that in a second. First, let me read you what the Second Amendment says. It says, a well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Now, today, modern conservatives interpret that as everybody gets to have any weapon they like, pretty much. And the Supreme Court has gone along with that interpretation. Now, the reality is, the first part of the amendment says, a well-regulated militia being necessary. So that is a very important qualifier, because back then they had militias, and they didn't want the United States government to take over all of the militias that they had. The point was militias, not, hey, Bob down the street gets to have any weapon he likes. They've forgotten that. They get very angry when you point that out. They claim to be strict constructionists. When you actually read the amendment back to them, their heads explode. Okay, so militia is the first part. The second part, they say there, is being necessary to the security of a free state. Now that's very interesting, because as Hartman points out, it originally did not say that. It had the word country instead of state. Let me show you the first draft of the Second Amendment by James Madison. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. A well-armed and well-regulated militia being the best security of a free country, but no person religiously scrupulous of bearing arms shall be compelled to render military service in person. So that was the entirety of the first draft of the Second Amendment. They changed the word country to state after significant debate on the issue, because they said, no, the point is for the states to be able to protect themselves. Not the people in the states, not individuals, for the states to protect themselves against the United States of America. Whoa, okay, now that's a totally different interpretation than what we have today. We say, no, it doesn't mean states, it doesn't mean militia, it just means, well, I get to have a gun, I get to have a gun, we all get to have guns. No, it doesn't say that. It says in order for a state to protect itself, it must have a well-regulated militia who must be armed, because if the militia isn't armed, well, then it can't protect itself. So let's go to Patrick Henry. Now, Patrick Henry was in principle opposed to slavery, but in reality, not opposed to slavery. He wanted to have it continue for practical reasons. I don't know how you split that, baby, but here's how he did so for the purpose of the Second Amendment. In the debates, when they were arguing over this issue, he said, let me here call your attention to that part, Article 1, Section 8 of the proposed Constitution, which allowed the United States to have an army, which gives the Congress power to provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia, and for governing such a part of them as may be employed in the service of the United States. By this, sir, you see that their control over our last and best defense is unlimited. If they neglect or refuse to discipline or arm our militia, they will be useless. The states can do neither, this power being exclusively given to Congress. The power of appointing officers over men not disciplined or armed is ridiculous, so that this pretended little remains of power left to the states may, at the pleasure of Congress, be rendered negatory. So he's saying, if you say that the United States Congress can organize an army or national militia and they can arm it, and then you allow them the right to unarm our state militias, well, then our state militias become pointless. Our state militias must be armed for two reasons. One is to have a defense against the United States of America, and two, so that we could have our slave patrols. That is what the militia in the South was predominantly used for. In fact, the first militias in America were started to put down slave rebellions. Like I said, there were militias in the North, and for example, George Washington had to put down a bit of a rebellion started by a militia in Pennsylvania. It was about militias. Okay. Now, in the South, though, they had this issue. Now, George Mason, another founding father, another slaveholder, he had 300 slaves, wrote this. Look, the militia may be here destroyed by the method which has been practiced in other parts of the world before. That is, by rendering them useless, by disarming them. Under various pretenses, Congress may neglect to provide for arming and disciplining the militia, and the state governments cannot do it, for Congress has an exclusive right to arm them under this proposed Constitution. So what they're saying is the Constitution says that you can have a federal army, but you can disarm the state militias. Well, we need an amendment to fix that. It's a very important amendment because it is going to protect not only states, but the South in particular, okay? Why? Because it gets to the issue of slavery. So now Patrick Henry discusses that head on. He says, if the country be invaded, a state may go to war, but cannot suppress slave insurrections under this new Constitution. If there should happen an insurrection of slaves, the country cannot be said to be invaded. They cannot therefore suppress it without the interposition of Congress. Congress and Congress only under this new Constitution can call forth the militia. In other words, I need to be able to call forth my militia to suppress a slave rebellion. What if the United States, the northern states, get more power, there's a slave rebellion, and they don't call forth the militia or the slave patrols to put it down? Well, then the slaves will overthrow us. And we can't have that, and the southern states will not agree. Unless you put the Second Amendment in, protecting our militias that do slave patrols, we're not in. You need to put that amendment into the Constitution. Otherwise, the North can do two things: get rid of our militias and let our slaves run wild. Or, as he alludes to here, they can actually conscript the slaves and thereby free them. And we can't have that. Fascinating. So he continues, in this state there are 236,000 blacks, and there are many in several other states. But there are few or none in northern states. May Congress not say that every black man must fight? Did we not see a little of this in the last war? He's right, in the Revolutionary War that did happen. We were not so hard pushed as to make emancipation general, but acts of assembly passed that every slave who would go to the army should be free. Oh, what if the Union decided that they're going to take all the blacks and use them as soldiers and now they're free? Can't have it. We need our slavery. We need our militia. We need our guns to protect our institution of slavery. I'm not the one saying it. You can't go, oh, you Brown, It's the Founding Fathers. Are the quotes incorrect? This is why they asked for the Second Amendment. Address the facts of the matter. You're not going to. You're going to say, oh, there are other factors. But I know there are other factors. But this was also a factor. It was a giant factor. I'm not saying it. They said it. All right, one more. At the time, manumission was what they called the idea that the Constitution could be used to free the slaves. And here's what Patrick Henry said. They will search that paper, referring to the Constitution, and see if they have the power of manumission. And have they not, sir? Have they not the power to provide for the general defense and welfare? May they not think that these call for the abolition of slavery? May they not pronounce all slaves free? And will they not be warranted by that power? This is no ambiguous implication or logical deduction. The paper speaks to the point. They have the power in clear, unequivocal terms and will clearly and certainly exercise it. See, this is not a minor issue when we were founding the country, and you can't just close your eyes and pretend not to see it. Remember, there was the famous 3/5 compromise. Slaves are not allowed to vote, but they count as 3/5 of a human being, so the South could have more votes as compared to the North. This is an issue they discussed and debated at great length. One of the resolutions was, let's get a Second Amendment that gives the states the right to arm their militias. Now, the North will use it in any way they like, and the South will use it to make sure there are no slave rebellions. Give me that Second Amendment so I can keep my slaves in line. Now, you might say, hey, you know what? Even if that was part of the intent for some of the Founding Fathers, I love it anyway. Okay, that's a position you come to. I just want you to understand the history of it so you're not confused about the context. This is the true context of the Second Amendment. Now, right now we don't have slaves, so you can say, hey, you know what? That's not a legitimate part of the discussion for today's world. Okay, fair enough. But back then, they also didn't have automatic weaponry. They didn't have AR-15s. They had muskets, right? And so in this case, you can't at the same time turn around and have the Supreme Court say, oh no, I'm looking at the context of the Second Amendment, and I see that they meant for everybody to have a gun and to have any kind of gun they like. Well, that's not what they meant, and that part is incredibly clear.